Zuri had always been different from the other girls in her village. While most were content with what life gave them, she carried dreams in her heart that stretched far beyond the dusty roads and small huts around her. She believed that life could be beautiful if one had love, respect, and a partner who truly cared. That was why when she met Kofi, a humble carpenter who worked with his hands and carried honesty in his eyes, her heart knew it had found a home. Kofi was not rich, his clothes were simple, and his tools were old, but he treated Zuri like a queen. He listened when she spoke, encouraged her dreams and promised her that together, even with little, they could build a life filled with joy. People whispered behind her back, asking why a girl like her would waste her beauty and intelligence on a poor man. But Zuri only smiled. She knew something they did not. Money could buy comfort, but it could never buy the warmth she felt when Kofi held her hand. In a world where status and wealth ruled, Zuri dared to choose love, even if it meant standing alone against the judgment of others. Backhand index pointing right Cheho to main ISI style main second outline the family's disapproval 200 words. Be leak done? When Zuri finally told her family about Kofi, the reaction was nothing close to what she had hoped for. Instead of joy or excitement, her relatives looked at her with shock and disappointment. Her mother shook her head in disbelief, and her uncles laughed bitterly, saying she had lost her mind. They could not understand why a young woman from a respected and wealthy family would choose a poor carpenter when men of influence, politicians and businessmen were lining up to marry her. They reminded her of the family name, the comfort she was born into, and the shame she would bring if she tied herself to a man with nothing but calloused hands and a tiny workshop. Some even mocked Kofi, calling him a beggar in disguise, saying love cannot fill an empty stomach. Every dinner at home became a battlefield. Her aunt would throw cruel words like daggers, telling her she would regret it. Her brothers mocked her, whispering about how she would soon be wearing rags and begging them for help. They painted pictures of her future filled with endless suffering, hunger and regret. But the more they attacked her choice, the stronger her heart held on to Kofi. She had seen the way he treated people with kindness, the way he worked hard even with little pay, and the way he looked at her as though she was the most precious gift in the world. Zuri tried to explain to her family that love was worth more than gold, that a man's wealth could disappear overnight, but a good heart would remain. But her words fell on deaf ears. They cared more about status than happiness. In their eyes, marrying Kofi meant stepping down from a throne into the dust. Yet Zuri was ready to take that risk, because deep inside she believed that true wealth was not in riches, but in love that never failed. Backhand index pointing right Cheho to main up third outline the painful wedding day 350 to 400 words. BISI engaging or emotional tone main leak done? The morning of Zuri's wedding was supposed to be the happiest day of her life, yet a heavy silence filled the air. She wore a simple but beautiful gown, her face glowing with love and hope, but her heart carried the weight of rejection. As she walked into the small church, her eyes scanned the rows of chairs. So many were empty. The absence of her family was loud, almost louder than the whispers of those who had come. Some guests murmured with pity, others smirked, shaking their heads as if to say, "She threw her life away for a poor man." Every glance, every whisper tried to pierce her courage, but Zuri lifted her chin high. Kofi stood at the altar, nervous yet shining with pride. He had no riches to offer her, but his eyes spoke volumes of the love he carried in his heart. When their eyes met, it was as though the world disappeared. In that moment, she knew she had made the right choice, no matter what anyone said. The vows were spoken softly, but each word carried a weight of truth and promise. It was not a grand wedding with gold and glitter, but it was filled with something far more precious: genuine love. Outside, some villagers whispered about her foolishness, saying she had traded palaces for poverty. But Zuri's smile never faded. As the couple walked out hand in hand, the sun broke through the clouds, lighting up her face. It was almost as if the heavens themselves were blessing their union. The pain of empty chairs and the absence of her family stung, but Zuri chose to focus on the man beside her. She had walked down the aisle alone, but she was leaving with a partner who would stand by her through every storm. That day, she proved that love was stronger than shame, and courage was more beautiful than wealth. Backhand index pointing right Kia AP chat. Ho main ISI flow main fourth outline struggles of a new life, 350 to 400 words. Be leak done? The first few weeks after the wedding felt like a sweet dream, but reality soon knocked on the door. Zuri and Kofi's new home was nothing like the spacious house she had grown up in. It was a small one-room hut with a leaky roof, cracked walls, and a squeaky old door. At night, the sound of rain dripping through the holes in the ceiling sometimes kept them awake. There was no fancy bed or shining furniture, just a simple mattress on the floor and a wooden table that Kofi had built with his own hands. Yet somehow, that little room carried more warmth than the mansion she had left behind. Every morning, Kofi left early with his toolbox, searching for carpentry jobs in the village. Some days he came home with money, but many times he returned empty-handed, covered in sweat and dust. Zuri also worked hard, selling vegetables at the market and helping neighbors with sewing to earn a little extra. Their meals were often nothing more than porridge or boiled yam, but they always shared it with laughter and gratitude. They would sit side by side on the floor, feeding each other and joking about how one day they would dine at a table filled with food and joy. Life outside their home was not so kind. People in the community mocked Zuri whenever she passed by. Some women whispered loudly about how she had left wealth behind to suffer in poverty. Children pointed at her faded clothes and laughed. Even her own relatives pretended not to know her. The rejection hurt deeply, but every time Zuri felt weak, Kofi's gentle hand reminded her that she was not alone. Though life was hard, their love became their strength. They leaned on each other when the world turned its back, reminding themselves that storms do not last forever. Every struggle they faced together only made their bond stronger. For Zuri, the little one-room home was not a symbol of lack, but a beginning, a seed planted in love that would one day grow into something far greater. Backhand index pointing right Kia Mainab Aap Kalia 5th. The whispers in the village soon turned into open mockery. Every time Zuri stepped out of her little hut, she could feel the eyes of neighbors following her. Women at the market would laugh loudly, pretending to talk among themselves but making sure she heard every word. "Look at her," they said. "She left her father's palace to live in a hut with a poor carpenter." Some would even exaggerate their pity, shaking their heads and sighing as if her life had become a tragedy. Children repeated the words they heard from adults, running after her shouting, "Poor wife, poor wife." The sting of humiliation burned deep, but Zuri refused to let the pain show on her face. She learned to walk with her head high, even when her heart ached inside. Whenever the insults grew louder, she would reach for Kofi's hand. His warm grip reminded her that she had chosen this path not out of ignorance, but out of love. Kofi often felt guilty, wishing he could give her more so that people would respect her. But Zuri would silence him with a smile and whisper, "I chose you, and I will keep choosing you every day." Those words gave him strength, even when the world mocked him as nothing but a poor carpenter. The cruelest moments came when Zuri met her old friends, dressed in bright clothes and surrounded by luxury. They looked her up and down with smirks, asking fake questions like, "So, how is life in your little palace?" Every word was coated with sarcasm. Zuri swallowed the hurt, refusing to break in front of them. She knew her worth was not measured by the walls of her house but by the love in her home. Though the laughter of neighbors was loud, the bond between Zuri and Kofi was louder. They faced the insults together, turning pain into fuel for hope. Zuri's faith in her husband never wavered, and every cruel word only made her cling to him tighter. For deep in her heart, she believed that one day those same mouths that mocked them would fall silent in awe of what love and patience cowl. After many months of struggling to survive and facing endless mockery, a new light entered Zuri's world. One morning she felt a change within her body, a quiet whisper of life growing inside her. When the healer confirmed that she was carrying a child, Zuri's eyes filled with tears of joy. She ran to Kofi, her hands trembling as she shared the news. For a moment the weight of poverty, the shame of rejection, and the pain of insults all disappeared. The sound of Kofi's laughter filled their little hut, and he lifted her off her feet, spinning her around with excitement. For the first time in a long while, their hearts were overflowing with hope. The pregnancy became Zuri's treasure, her proof that love had given her something priceless. Whenever people laughed at her torn clothes or mocked her tiny home, she would rest her hand on her stomach and smile. Inside her was a future no one could take away. Kofi began working harder than ever, spending long days under the hot sun, building furniture and carrying heavy wood, determined to prepare for the arrival of their child. He returned home exhausted, but the thought of becoming a father kept him strong. Even though life was still hard, their hearts were lighter. At night, Zuri and Kofi would sit together, talking about names for the baby, dreaming of the future. They imagined their child running through the village, strong and full of laughter, a living reminder that their love had survived every storm. The neighbors still whispered cruelly, but Zuri no longer felt broken. She carried within her the greatest answer to their mockery, a child born not out of wealth or status, but out of deep, unshakable love. For Zuri, the pregnancy was more than just the promise of a baby. It was the beginning of a new chapter, the seed of hope planted in the soil of struggle. She knew that with this child their story would change. And in her heart she believed that one day, the same people who mocked them would come to witness tea. When their baby finally arrived, Zuri and Kofi felt as though heaven itself had smiled on them. Holding the tiny bundle in their arms gave them strength to face the world with fresh courage. Even though their pockets were empty, their hearts overflowed with gratitude. So when it came time for the baby dedication, they decided it would not be just a quiet family moment. They wanted it to be a celebration, a testimony that love, faith, and endurance had carried them this far. With very little money they began to plan. Kofi polished old benches he had built himself, turning them into seats for guests. Zuri washed and ironed her one good dress over and over until it looked almost new. They cooked simple meals, rice, beans, and a small pot of stew, stretching every coin they had. It wasn't a feast of kings, but it was prepared with love and pride. In their little hut, Zuri carefully decorated the space with handmade flowers crafted from colorful scraps of fabric. To her, every piece carried meaning. Every detail was a prayer of hope. Most shocking of all, they sent out invitations to everyone. Family, neighbors, even those who had laughed at their struggles. People whispered, wondering how a poor couple could dare to host such an event. But Zuri and Kofi believed strongly that one day God would turn their story around, and they wanted the very people who mocked them to witness it. On the night before the dedication, Zuri barely slept. She looked at her baby's peaceful face and whispered promises of a better future. Kofi sat by her side, his hands rough from work but tender as he held their child. They prayed together, asking God to bless the day and use it to silence every voice that had risen against them. Though their table was small and their pockets were light, Zuri and Kofi's hearts were rich with expectation. They were not just preparing for a baby dedication, they were preparing for a miracle, believing that somehow, in the middle of their poverty summit, the morning of the baby dedication came with golden sunlight streaming through the cracks of their little hut. Zuri rose before dawn, her heart pounding with a mix of nerves and joy. She had carefully prepared her outfit the night before, a glowing African attire sewn from bright patterned fabric she had saved for years. It was not new, but when she wore it she looked like a queen. Her baby, wrapped in colorful cloth, rested peacefully in her arms, his tiny breaths a reminder of why this day was so special. Outside, the village buzzed with curiosity. People who had mocked them came, not out of love, but to see what kind of celebration a poor carpenter and his wife could host. Some expected embarrassment, others came simply to laugh. But still, the crowd grew larger than Zuri or Kofi had imagined. Neighbors filled the benches Kofi had polished, while children ran around, whispering about how small the feast would be. Zuri's relatives, dressed in fine clothes and jewelry, walked in late with proud expressions, as if to remind her of what she had left behind. Despite the tension, Zuri stood tall. She held her baby close, smiling with a quiet confidence that silenced her trembling heart. Kofi, standing beside her, looked at her with pride as if she were the most beautiful woman alive. Together they welcomed the guests, offering food that was simple but served with warmth and dignity. The stew simmered in small pots, the rice was carefully shared, and though it wasn't a grand banquet, there was enough for everyone to taste. The ceremony began with prayers and songs, voices rising into the sky. As the baby was lifted for blessing, Zuri's eyes filled with tears. She remembered every insult, every night of hunger, every moment of doubt, and yet, here she was, dedicating the child of love and hope before the same people who thought she would fail. The air was heavy with expectation. The crowd waited to see if the day would end in shame or surprise. And though the dedication ceremony was already filled with whispers and quiet laughter when suddenly, the sound of engines broke through the songs and chatter. Everyone turned their heads as a convoy of shiny, expensive cars rolled slowly into the dusty village road. The sight alone was enough to silence the crowd. Children stopped playing, women froze with food in their hands, and even Zuri's proud relatives stood in disbelief. No one in the community had ever seen such luxury up close. From the lead car, a tall man in an elegant suit stepped out. His shoes gleamed, his watch sparkled, and his presence carried the air of power and wealth. It was the kind of man people only heard about in stories, a billionaire. The gasps rose louder as murmurs spread like fire. Who is he? Why would a man of his status come here? The villagers stared wide-eyed, some even pushing forward to get a better view. Zuri and Kofi exchanged confused glances. They had not invited anyone like this. Their hearts raced, unsure whether this unexpected guest came with good intentions or to humiliate them further. But the man's eyes searched the crowd until they landed on Kofi. Slowly, a smile spread across his face, and he walked directly toward the poor carpenter and his wife. The whispers turned into shocked silence. Every step the billionaire took felt heavy with mystery. Relatives who had mocked Kofi now shifted uncomfortably in their seats, wondering if there was a hidden connection they knew nothing about. Some villagers began to gossip that maybe Kofi was not as poor as he seemed, or perhaps fate itself was about to reveal a secret. By the time the billionaire finally reached them, the entire crowd was holding its breath. He looked at Kofi, then at the baby in Zuri's arms, and spoke words that would change everything. His arrival was no accident, it was destiny. In that moment, the dedication turned from a humble village gathering into a stage for a miracle that no one would ever forget. The crowd leaned forward, their eyes wide, waiting for the billionaire to speak. Zuri clutched her baby tighter, her heart racing while Kofi stood frozen, unsure of what was happening. Then the man smiled warmly and said words that left everyone stunned. He revealed that many years ago, long before the world knew his name, he had been a young man who had lost everything. He was broke, hungry, and hopeless. No one wanted to help him. People mocked him, turned him away, and treated him as though he was invisible. But on one of those darkest days when he had nowhere to go, it was Kofi, the poor carpenter standing before him, who had shown him kindness. Kofi had shared his food, given him a place to rest for the night, and spoken words of encouragement that kept him from giving up. "You told me," the billionaire said, his voice trembling. "Hardship is not forever. One day your story will change. Keep going." Those words carried me when I wanted to quit. The silence in the crowd was so heavy that even the wind seemed to pause. Neighbors who once mocked Kofi now stared at him in disbelief. Relatives who had called him worthless shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They remembered the insults, the laughter, the rejection, and now here was proof that the man they had despised was a silent hero. The billionaire went on to explain that he had never forgotten that day. Even as success found him, even as he built his empire, he had searched for the man who had lifted him when he was down. "And today," he said, his eyes filled with emotion, "I have finally found you, Kofi, the man who gave me hope when I had nothing." Tears welled in Zuri's eyes while Kofi stood speechless, his lips trembling. The crowd gasped in awe, realizing they were witnessing a divine twist of fate. What many thought was shame had turned into honor. The poor carpenter they mocked was being remembered and rewarded by a billionaire, whose life he had touched long ago. Backhand index pointing right Kia main isi ton. The crowd was still buzzing with shock when the billionaire lifted his hand, calling for silence. His voice was calm but powerful, carrying across the gathering like a drumbeat. He turned to Kofi and Zuri, then looked at the baby cradled in Zuri's arms. With tears in his eyes, he declared that this child would never suffer the way he once did. Right there, in front of everyone, he announced that he would sponsor the child's entire future, from school to university, no matter the cost. Gasps filled the air. People could not believe what they were hearing. But he didn't stop there. He went on to promise Kofi and Zuri a brand new home, a place where rain would never leak through the roof, where their child could grow up with dignity and comfort. He described how his construction company would begin building immediately, and that within weeks, the family would move into a house that would shine brighter than anything their critics had ever imagined. Neighbors who had once laughed at the small hut now hung their heads in shame, while Zuri's proud relatives sat frozen, unable to believe the tables had turned so dramatically. The billionaire then looked at Kofi with deep respect. "You gave me shelter when I was a stranger," he said, "and today I will open doors for you that no one can ever shut." He promised to give Kofi work in his companies, not as a servant, but as a trusted partner who had already proven his heart of gold. His words echoed through the crowd, breaking every lie spoken against them. Zuri could no longer hold back her tears. She cried openly, her shoulders trembling, while Kofi held her hand so tightly it almost hurt. For so long they had lived with nothing, mocked and rejected. But in a single moment, their story was rewritten before the very eyes of those who doubted them. The crowd erupted in awe, some cheering, others speechless. What began as a humble baby dedication had turned into a miracle, a blessing beyond imagination, proof that love and... The crowd was still buzzing with shock when the billionaire lifted his hand, calling for silence. His voice was calm but powerful, carrying across the gathering like a drumbeat. He turned to Kofi and Zuri, then looked at the baby cradled in Zuri's arms. With tears in his eyes, he declared that this child would never suffer the way he once did. Right there, in front of everyone, he announced that he would sponsor the child's entire future, from school to university, no matter the cost. Gasps filled the air. People could not believe what they were hearing. But he didn't stop there. He went on to promise Kofi and Zuri a brand new home, a place where rain would never leak through the roof, where their child could grow up with dignity and comfort. He described how his construction company would begin building immediately, and that within weeks, the family would move into a house that would shine brighter than anything their critics had ever imagined. Neighbors who had once laughed at the small hut now hung their heads in shame, while Zuri's proud relatives sat frozen, unable to believe the tables had turned so dramatically. The billionaire then looked at Kofi with deep respect. "You gave me shelter when I was a stranger," he said. "And today I will open doors for you that no one can ever shut." He promised to give Kofi work in his companies, not as a servant, but as a trusted partner who had already proven his heart of gold. His words echoed through the crowd, breaking every lie spoken against them. Zuri could no longer hold back her tears. She cried openly, her shoulders trembling, while Kofi held her hand so tightly it almost hurt. For so long they had lived with nothing, mocked and rejected. But in a single moment, their story was rewritten before the very eyes of those who doubted them. The crowd erupted in awe, some cheering, others speechless. What began as a humble baby dedication had turned into a miracle, a blessing beyond imagination, proof that love and... What began as a quiet, humble baby dedication soon transformed into something that felt like a grand festival. The moment the billionaire finished speaking, the entire atmosphere shifted. Drums began to beat louder, voices rose in songs of praise, and the little gathering exploded with joy. The villagers who had come out of curiosity now found themselves clapping, cheering, and celebrating with all their hearts. It was as though heaven itself had joined in, turning the day into a feast of miracles. Children who had once teased Zuri now danced freely in the dusty yard, their laughter echoing like music. Women who had doubted her clapped their hands, swaying to the rhythm of the drums. Even the men who had mocked Kofi's poverty now shouted praises, unable to deny the hand of destiny at work. What was meant to be a day of quiet prayers had suddenly become the greatest celebration the village had seen in years. Food that seemed too little in the morning somehow stretched to feed everyone. Plates of rice and stew passed from hand to hand, cups of drink were raised high, and blessings poured from every corner. Relatives who once turned their backs now stepped forward, trying to shake hands and act as though they had supported the couple all along. But the truth was clear. This celebration did not belong to them. It belonged to Zuri, Kofi, and the miracle God had written into their story. Zuri stood in the center, glowing in her bright attire, her baby safe in her arms. Kofi's eyes never left her. He looked at her with the pride of a man who knew love had carried them to this moment. The music grew louder, the dancing wilder, the joy uncontainable. Strangers poured in from nearby villages just to witness the sight. What was once expected to be a poor man's shame had turned into a king's festival. The dedication had become more than a blessing for a child. It had become a testimony for the whole community, proof that when love and faith endure, even the smallest begin. As the music echoed through the village and laughter filled the air, Zuri stood still for a moment, her eyes fixed on Kofi. Tears of pride welled up, blurring her vision, but her heart saw everything clearly. She remembered the empty chairs at their wedding, the cruel words from relatives, the laughter of neighbors when she carried water in her torn dress. She remembered nights when they went to bed hungry, holding each other for strength. Through it all, she had chosen him, the man with nothing but a good heart and hands that never stopped working. And now, standing in the glow of this miracle, she knew she had made the right choice. Kofi noticed her tears and gently reached for her hand, squeezing it as if to say, "We made it." His eyes held the same love he had given her from the very beginning, but now there was something more, pride. Pride that the woman who could have had everything chose him instead, and that her choice had brought them blessings beyond imagination. Around them, people who once mocked whispered in disbelief. They saw with their own eyes that wealth without love meant nothing, but love with faith could move mountains. Zuri's life was proof. While others had chased gold, she had chosen a heart of gold, and that decision had written a story greater than riches ever could. The billionaire's promises meant security, houses, education, and opportunities they had never dreamed of. But for Zuri, the real treasure stood right beside her. The blessings were powerful, yes, but the greatest blessing was the love that carried them through storms, through shame, through hunger, and now into honor. As she gazed at Kofi, her heart whispered, "I did not lose anything. I gained everything." In that moment, she realized love had triumphed over money, status, and pride. Love had rewritten their destiny. And in front of the entire village, Zuri and Kofi became living proof that true love is stronger, richer, and more powerful than all the gold in the world. As the celebration slowly came to an end, Zuri and Kofi stood together, their baby safe in her arms, their fingers locked tightly as if they would never let go. The little hut that once held their struggles would soon be replaced with a home of dignity, their child's future secured, and their honor restored before everyone who had doubted them. For the first time in years, Zuri did not feel the sting of shame. Instead, her heart overflowed with peace. Neighbors who once laughed now spoke with respect. Relatives who had mocked now bowed their heads, unable to meet her eyes. And as the drums beat softly in the distance, people whispered about how their story would be told for generations. It was more than just a baby dedication. It was a miracle, a living testimony that life can change in a single moment. Zuri looked at Kofi and smiled through her tears. She had not chosen wrongly. In choosing love, she had chosen the greatest wealth of all. Together, they had walked through fire and come out shining brighter than gold. Their story became a lesson to the entire community. Never despise humble beginnings, never mock love, and never doubt what destiny can do. Hand in hand, they walked forward into a new beginning. Not just as a poor carpenter and his wife, but as living proof that true love and faith can rewrite any story. Backhand index pointing right up AAP Cheho to main Puri 15 outlines key script KO combine Karka Ek. Complete 4,000 plus word story Bana done?